was the central point where everyone met each Sunday and everyone knew one another, and they bought pews. If you donated more money, you could get a better, almost like the Eagles or the Phillies. You give more money, you can get a better ticket. Back then, you paid more, you could get a particular pew that was closer to the altar. You couldn't show up with your biracial children, into the Protestant churches. The blacks weren't allowed in there. So there was an effort that was intentional to not identify your parentage to a biracial child. You saw it over and over again. Sure, Tina.
Dave, I was talking recently with a Reverend McCleary, who grew up in Cecil County in Fairhill, and his family had slaves, and their slaves were on the balcony at Rock Presbyterian Church.
Oh.
And also Tucker Mackey, who owns a 600-acre farm and has the Apple Butter Festival. I was the secretary for the group, the Elk Creek Preservation Society, and when Obama was running against Hillary, I was for Obama and he was for Hillary, and he wouldn't vote for Obama because he considered his family had slaves, and he considered Obama as just another slave. Is that recent, that this feeling of this whole thing, and just right down the road from Delaware?
And what is his ethnic background?
He's Scottish.
There was that.
It's amazing how sensitive it is. Even in this year, I got out of the organization. I was just disgusted.
Yeah, there's a story about Mother Bethel Church, the oldest black church in town here, where blacks started to, it just happened earlier, I'm going to mix up the story. Some blacks wanted to sit down on the first floor, and they told them to go up to the balcony, and they refused to do that, and then they started another church, so that's not an uncommon occurrence. It was a thought that they were secondary citizens.
Well, they're buried in the same cemetery, though.
Well, not originally. Originally, there was only one black cemetery in Philadelphia called the Olive Cemetery in West Philadelphia. And it was going to be bankrupt. It was going to be closed down. They were going to reinter people. Stephen Smith interceded and saved Olive Cemetery. It was another thing that he did in terms of saving the black stake here. Stephen Smith at Olive Cemetery has since been moved to Eden Cemetery in West Philadelphia. And Stephen Smith is buried there with his business partner, William Whipper, and his mother, which I need to get into the story of his mother, Nancy Smith. That's an inspiring thing. But the thing is, there isn't a marker for Stephen Smith. No one knows where he's buried in his graveyard. There's a historical marker for him, but no one knows where he is. No one knows where his mother is. These are heroes. Slavery was not only tearing black culture apart, it was tearing white culture apart. The runaways, what had happened was people like Stephen Smith and William Whipper had helped so many runaways to freedom that you weren't ever going to be able to go back. It's almost today with Mexicans that have immigrated, illegally here to the United States. There's over 20 million illegal Mexicans here. You can't arrest all these individuals. You can't, I don't want to say our immigration doesn't mean anything, but they've really kind of illegitimize that southern border to some degree. That's what happened with slavery. Stephen Smith and William Whipper and Harriet Tubman and people like this had helped so many runaways to freedom that you could never go back. I mentioned this in my outline about the Emancipation Proclamation. This Jeff's here to talk about it too. You're taught in school that Abe Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, what happened in 1863 was that Gettysburg occurred, and the war needed to end, and Lincoln was trying to drive an ending to the war. With his Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't free any slaves in the border states. He didn't free any slave that he had the authority to free. He didn't free him in Maryland. He didn't free him in Delaware. His Emancipation Proclamation, if you want to say, freed slaves in the Confederacy where he had no authority to do so. It would be like Obama saying, people in Cuba don't pay their taxes. He doesn't have the authority to tell the Cubans not to pay their taxes. And Lincoln didn't have the authority to free the slaves that he did in the Emancipation Proclamation. The real message of the Emancipation Proclamation was that blacks who are enslaved in the South, if you make it up north, we have a uniform for you, we have 3 warm meals for you, and we've got a gun. And we're going to point you back to your slaveholders if you come on up here. That was the message. It was a veiled message in the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln didn't free slaves that he had the authority to. He was inviting runaways to come and enlist into the Union. And that's when the Civil War changed, was when blacks entered into the conflict. Originally they were acting as guards, and they would have them as digging ditches, etc. But later on, about a year later, they started to be involved in the conflicts. That was the movie Glory with Denzel Washington was about this. And one of the Stidhams, a biracial Stidham, also enlisted and was part of that Massachusetts 54th Infantry that went down to South Carolina and died and was killed in battle. And Stephen Smith was a pastor of that church. It was in Cape May, New Jersey, the AME church in Cape May, New Jersey. Stephen Smith started it. And this Stidham was killed in South Carolina in 1864, and his wife, grieved out loud about it, and Stephen Smith consoled her. It's a part of the church record there in Cape May. So a lot of these biracial individuals, some who came out of the Swedish origins, because the Swedes had these slaves, they enlisted at Camp William Penn over in Cheltenham, and fought for the Union and changed the tide of the war. They're really kind of national heroes that you don't know too much about. That hopefully this book will draw some attention to, but there's a deeper story about some of that. But I want to touch on Nancy Smith. We got to get out here at 2 o'clock, and we're kind of tight on time. Am I keeping you guys' interested?
Yes.
Okay.
They just went through. Some of them did their. I have a few kids in here thesis regarding the Emancipation Proclamation.
Oh.
We saw the movie Glory.
You saw the movie Glory. Okay,
There's a few kids in here that have done projects on the 54th Massachusetts. They know a lot about it.
Oh, super. Okay, so you know that what I'm saying is confirming what you probably already know about. But let me tell you a little bit about Nancy Smith, because she is another incredible individual that you don't really have a paper trail on. But Nancy Smith was born into slavery. She was a slave in Cecil County. And her slave master was a guy by the name of Cochrane, of Scottish, Irish descent. And Nancy gives birth to Stephen Smith, who's biracial. So who's Stephen Smith's father? He's white.
He's slave owner.
Probably, right? He's probably a slave owner, who had... And Nancy Smith doesn't want this illegitimate kid on the plantation. That's my speculation, she doesn't want this offspring around her plantation. So she puts an ad... Sure.
Nancy Smith is his mom?
Yes.
She doesn't want him?
Oh, I'm sorry.
She doesn't want him?
Well, no. The white slave man, Mrs. Cochrane, doesn't want Stephen Smith, an illegitimate child, on the plantation. She wants to get rid of this claim on the property, and, that's speculation on my part. There's no paper trail. I'm just telling you what I saw. I'm kind of filling in the gaps. But it is speculation. It's Anyway, she puts an ad in the paper that, hey, I got a slave for sale, Stephen Smith. And this General Bowd purchases Stephen Smith at 5, 6 years old to work in this lumber yard. Well, a couple weeks later, who shows up at General Bowd's house but Nancy Smith? She runs away from the plantation. Pretty brave thing to do for a woman, at nighttime running away. You got bloodhounds tracking you, etc. She shows up at General Bowd's lumber yard. She wants to be with her son. Son's 5 years old. Plus she might get sold off. I imagine the white Cochrane woman doesn't really like Nancy Smith very much, would be my guess. On the plantation. She might get sold off, whatever. She shows up at General Bowd's house. General Bowd takes her in and says, sure, you can stay with your son. So he has both. And General Bowd is connected with the Quakers. He's a